Hello again, YouTube. My name is Bree, and in today's video, I'm going to try to show you how I paint skin. Now, this video has been requested, but it's a topic I'm not fully comfortable talking about. So instead of just trying to give a tutorial, because I don't think I'm qualified to do a tutorial, I wanted to talk you through a few things I learned that helped me develop the way I paint skin. So in this video, I'm going to be going through some of those items, and what I'm hoping is that if you are new to painting skin, or maybe you've been doing it for a while, but maybe you could still pick up a few tips and tricks. And then I will do another video where I paint a portrait and kind of show where I'm using those techniques and tips I mentioned in this video to kind of pull it all together. So first of all, excuse me because I am super awkward about talking and doing things at the same time, so we'll just see how it goes. But the first thing I wanted to talk about is a little color theory, and this is a really big topic. So I'm just going to try to skim the surface. Before I even go on any further, I do want to talk about this book very briefly. This is James Gurney's Color and Light, and I cannot recommend this book enough. This book it was just an amazing read in general, and I definitely recommend it if you're looking for any information about these topics. And if you buy it from his website, he will sign it and draw a little dinosaur in it. So if you have the little extra money, don't get it at bookstore prices. I don't have this particular book signed, and I'm sad about it. Essentially, I'm using this book today because I don't have a color wheel, and I don't have something where I could digitally show you the color wheel without it getting really wonky. So I just wanted to reference a few parts of this book. Once again, very much recommend it. Maybe the library even has it if you can't get a copy of it, just to check it out, because anything James Gurney is amazing for starters. But anyway, I'm already getting extremely distracted. All right, long, awkward zoom. So basically, I wish I had a bigger color wheel to show you, but the color wheel, I'm sure you've seen it before. Looking at a color wheel isn't news. But basically, all of our most saturated colors are going to be at the outside, and as we come together, it's all these color mixes. Now, I really like how these were broken down in kind of a more realistic fashion here. I'm working in very small desk constraints. I don't even have a tripod for my mic. It's really awkward. So that's why you get all the random background noise. But here, it kind of stages the different variations of the colors you get as you mix them together, with yellow, green, cyan, blue, magenta, and red on the outside. And there's just a few different versions of it that are really helpful. But the main thing I wanted to point out here was that when you're looking at the outside of the color wheel, those are going to be your colors that are fully saturated. And basically, when you're looking at skin tones, you're never going to be on the outside of the color wheel. So that's one of the key items. Basically, any skin mixture that you're making is either going to be... Okay, hold on. I need to say this because I think I skipped right over this. This is just how I paint skin. It's not the law of the land. And any of the things I say you need to do, you should do, is a mistake. You do what works for you. You find your own techniques, and your style might drive you in a different direction. I mean, you look at The Simpsons, and that show's been running for ages, and they're all like super yellow and orange. So, you do you. This is just me explaining how I work and some general things, and I could be completely wrong too. Disclaimer. But anyway, in general, skin tones are not going to be the outside of the color wheel. Instead, what we want to do is bring our colors a bit more inward. And to do that, in general, you're going to be mixing a yellow and a red, but then you need to pull it inward, because a yellow and a red, you're going to land in orange. And then to bring it down into a more neutral area, the easiest way to do that with a limited color palette is to add blue. So super basic color theory as it applies to color mixing. Very exciting stuff there. But one thing I really do like about this book rearranging is this chart. And hopefully we don't have too much glare. All right, so I can't zoom in too much more here, but basically this chart actually breaks down pigments. It doesn't include every pigment, but it does a really good job of breaking down where pigments lie on the color wheel. So if you're not comfortable figuring this out, and I know the concepts of like a warm red, a cool yellow, it's a lot to try to map out yourself when you're new to it, and to try to figure out where your colors might lie so that you can make the mixes you want to mix. But essentially the concepts of warm and cool, you have your yellows, your reds, and your blues, and a cool yellow is going to be one that leans green. A warm one is going to lean red. Reds, the warm is going to lean towards yellow and the cool towards blue. And then with the blue, the warm leans towards the red and the cool leans towards the green. So when I refer to cool and warm, that's kind of what I'm going with. And I'm going to use this just to make it simpler, because I know I'll probably get tongue-tied and say it wrong at some point and just confuse you further. So generally speaking, for mixing colors, I like to use a warm yellow, both a warm and a cool red, and a warm blue. Once again, this is just my personal preference, and you might find different mixtures that work for you. There are people who use green super effectively in skin tones. And I should point out that some people consider green a primary. I can't remember if Gurney speaks to that or if he believes that, but some people think, because I mean, you look at the breakdown, there's a huge section of this that's green, and some people do consider green a necessity on a palette. Because I tend to do a lot of skin tones, and like I said, I keep things on this side. Green isn't as essential to me. But in my skin tone palettes, one of my favorites is yellow ochre. As you can see, that's already quite a ways inward on the color wheel. So it just shortcuts a lot of the mixing for me. You can use any yellow you want, but you, like when I did the little elf boy from my last video with the A Gallo paints, because I was using, and I don't think it's here. Oh yeah, it is quinacridone gold. It's more orange, and it's a stronger color. And I think honestly, it's probably even a little stronger than that. I had to use additional blue to bring it down. So here we have yellow ochre, and here we have pyrrole red, which are two of the main colors I'll use in skin tones. And as I mix them, you draw basically a straight line across. So you're not going to be able to mix a yellow ochre and a pyrrole red and get an orange up here. It's just not feasible. If you want to get oranges up here, you're going to either have to get an orange in that range or mix it with a much more vibrant yellow. Now, one thing to keep in mind with yellows is that yellows are transparent. No matter what medium you use, yellows are going to be the more transparent of color. They also are the least, they have the lowest value. So if you were to take an entire color wheel or all your colors and make it black and white, they're going to be the lightest. Blues are going to be some of your darkest, and reds are they're not as dark as blue by default. Of course, you can also have like a sky blue. I'm just talking about when you're looking at that outside of the color wheel at the max tinting strength of these colors. Yellows are going to be the weakest in terms of value. What that means is generally, if you want more yellow, you're going to have to add more yellow. So in a mix between, say, yellow ochre and pyrrole red, I have to add a lot more of the yellow to bring it towards a middle point, or it's going to be completely overwhelmed by that red and be drawn this way. So in general, with the skin mixes, I'm going to add a bunch of yellow, some red, and we're going to end up somewhere in the middle. And then I'll add like ultramarine blue. Indanthrone not on this chart, but it's another warm blue. And so if I'm here now, kind of in the quinacridone orange range, and I add this blue, it's going to pull me this way. As blue is a very strong color, it's very high on, it has a very dark value in comparison to these other colors, and generally blues tend to even be a bit more staining. It's going to move very quickly across this chart. So we want to be very careful just to add a little blue, because we only want to bring it down into a slightly desaturated range. Now, these colors can be a bit misleading, because you're not going to mix yellow ochre and pyrrole red and then end up in Venetian red because you add a little blue. That's just the fully pigmented version of that color. You in general, all of these colors have their own range, their own, depending on how much white's there, how much water in terms of watercolor. So I like to think of this section generally in both terms of its light values and its dark values. And when I'm mixing my first washes for skin color, everything's very diluted. So it's just, when you look at the chart, you might see this go into Venetian red. It's not going to Venetian red, but it is getting to be a more neutral. Now, if you use a lot more pigment and a lot less water, you can get these darker values. And in doing that, you can definitely get darker skin tones with the same general mixes. I like to cheat a little bit when I am working with darker skin tones, which is something I don't do enough. But I tend to, instead of starting with the yellow ochre, I might start with the sienna just to bring the value up a bit. Or in some cases, like when I'm doing really dark shadows, I actually like toying with some Venetian red. I'll mix it with some blue to get a really nice dark neutral. So generally speaking, I like to work limited color palettes, but I do like to play with some browns in there as well in skin tones. And depending on what you're doing, you might like a different starting point, whether it be more of a cadmium yellow, a yellow ochre, a raw sienna. It really is a personal preference thing here. Now, I don't know if I'm making any sense at this point, but I'm going to go ahead and switch over. I think I could leave that up. We'll just put that aside for a second. So like I said, one of my go-to colors is yellow ochre. For the reds, pyrrole red, something really neutral like this is generally where I'm going to go. But sometimes it's also fun to work with a much warmer red, like a vermilion or something that leans slightly orange. It's very effective as well. For the cool reds, you've heard me talk a lot about alizarin crimson. Alizarin crimson's great for painting in a sketchbook, but it is, I'm realizing I'm already falling off the screen. Alizarin crimson is a fugitive color, and using this original PR83, you're going to not have a painting you're going to want to hang up because it's going to fade. This color will definitely turn to brown. So I did want to mention it in this video just because I talk about it. I use it so much. It's one of my favorite colors, but it's not something you're going to want to use for something that you're going to either try to sell or hang up, because it's not going to last, unfortunately. And then for the warm blues, I've mentioned both French ultramarine and Indanthrone blue. As you could see, Indanthrone blue is a very deep value. Ultramarine's much lighter. So you don't have to be as cautious about adding, just like with Indanthrone, you're going to want to add just a little dot of blue paint. French ultramarine, you could be a little bit freer with that mix. The thing to know, if you're using French ultramarine, it is a granulating color, so the more blue you put in, the more granulation you're going to see. There are non-granulating ultramarines. They're called ultramarine finest typically. French ultramarine is always going to be granulating. Ultramarine finest may not. So in general, I think today I'll probably work with this palette, but we'll see. It's very... You could start playing with multiple different variations and get skin tones. In my most recent video, I used a Gallo, and almost none of these colors were in this palette. So in this case, since I have it here, I'll bring it up. I didn't have yellow ochre, so I used quinacridone gold. I didn't have Pyro Red, so I use this Medici Red, which is far more orange. I use the Alizarin Crimson Hue, which took the place of the Cool Red, and I use the Yinmen Blue instead of like an ultramarine. So it's the same general idea of picking that warm yellow, a warm and cool red, and a warm blue for the mixes, but the actual colors can vary. And I still think it turned out pretty good. So it was just very granulating, which I'm not used to for skin tones. So moving from here, I did want to talk about one other thing before I get out of the color. Well, I guess I could ramble for ages about this stuff, and I don't know if this is interesting at all, but so let's talk about at least one more thing, and that's, you'll notice on these cards right away that these are all single pigments. These as well. Hopefully I've been on camera because I'm not paying enough attention to where the camera is, and I'm leaning kind of at an angle to get to my mic. Oh, I've already got cat fur and hair all over this. Sorry for being gross. So one thing to keep in mind when you're selecting colors is the complexity that is added by using multi-pigment blends. When you're using a single pigment, it's typically pretty easy to map. You could say like yellow ochre is here, this is PY43, or in some cases I think PY42, and generally it's going to be here on a color wheel. Ultramarine, there are definitely variations, but generally it's going to be here. As you start to play with multi-pigments, quinacridone gold is actually a good example because this is probably based on the original quinacridone gold and not the mixes that are made now, since that particular pigment ran out, unfortunately. So as you start to play with mixes, you're going to get more variation both brand to brand and within your mixes themselves. So if you were to use something that blended, and I know this is a common one, I'm completely losing my train of thought already, but there's a lot of blends in the red area that uses like PV15 and PR122. There's a lot that end up in this area that are blends. So as you start to pull together different colors, you don't exactly know where in that line you are when you the first time you use that, and especially as you start to move into things that are mixing 3 different colors. You can see where the color lands by swatching it, but there's a certain additional amount of brush mileage you need to be able to understand how that's going to work in mixes, because think about like when you were a kid and you played with crayons and you mixed together a bunch of different colors and you got really yucky brown. That's kind of what you risk when you mix together a bunch of different watercolors, and when you mix together a bunch of different, even fewer watercolors that contain more pigments. I'm not saying don't do this, don't play with it. It's just easier for me personally to work with single pigments because I know where it lands and I feel I have more control over it. The more you get used to your pigments though and your colors, it's all mileage. The more you swatch it, the more you play with it, the better you get to know them. Suddenly it's not as much of an issue. You can do whatever you want with them and you know it's going to work out. But in the beginning, I definitely tend to find that having those single pigments just makes your life a little easier because you have more control over it. So just kind of throwing those down. Now, one thing you're going to notice from this particular layout here, I said one more thing. I'm going to talk for ages. Already, all of our colors are on this section of the wheel. What that means is that we're not going to be able to mix any colors using this set that land within this region of the color wheel. Basically, if we're taping off our color wheel right now, we're going to go from yellow ochre up to Pyro Red, down to quinacridone. I'm not seeing quinacridone rose, but we'll say quinacridone magenta for simplicity, and down to ultramarine. And everything's going to exist in that sliver on the color wheel. However, colors are more about relationships than they are about where they actually exist. So the beauty of using a limited color palette is that you can build these relationships and make something that, while on its own and like if I mix yellow ochre and blue, ultramarine blue, we're gonna land somewhere in this region. And at a first glance, that's not a green. This is a green. However, if we put that side by a red, it's going to look green. So when we paint, we can work with these relationships to make colors appear to be more than they are. And that keeps things pretty interesting. It's also something to keep in mind that if you're mixing like skin tones and you spend all that time laying down this beautiful face on a page, as you're working, you're starting against white, probably. I mean, you could definitely have an underpainting, but if you're just working on a plain sketchbook page like I am, you're starting against white. And everything is going to appear very dark and vibrant by comparison to that white page. If you build up all your values, you have all your shading in place, and then you put down, say, dark brown or black hair, everything can immediately become extremely washed out. And that, once again, is about relationships. In this case, probably more about the value relationship than the color relationship. So those are just some things to keep in mind in general for color theory and values in general. I've already rambled on this too much, and I'm getting nowhere closer to actually painting skin at this point. So hopefully some of these topics helped. This book also, and I'm not sure I'm going to find it offhand, but there's a whole section on color relationships, actually. I just happened to open that one. Here we go. Working in these limited color palettes that I mentioned. So just more things that were really cool in this book and something to play with in the future. Now, that all being said, I think it's time to actually pull out some paints and play around with them and move into the next topic. Okay, so I feel like a complete mess. I do not have enough space on my desk for everything. So what I'm going to try to do is talk through it and do some mixing where you can see it. And I don't really have the space for this massive palette on this desk with the sketchbook, with the mic and the camera equipment. So we're going to do the best we can. So we're going to start with just our basics. Here's our yellow ochre. Here's my pyrrole red. Now, I think you can already see, I just put water down on that. I don't know if I'm close enough to the mic where you could hear me. That color is so dense in terms of saturation that it's already completely consumed my water cup. So you can already, I think, see that mixing these two, you're going to have to weigh far heavily in the favor of yellow ochre to be able to get that orange, or the red's completely going to consume it. That's my quinacridone rose. Generally, I like to add the rosier hues later and start with the warmer reds in the initial skin mixes. I'm not sure how much I'm going to be able to get into everything today, but that will definitely be referenced later as I start to go through the actual painting in the next video. And that's my ultramarine. So, man, I do not know how to do this video. I gave myself so much time to think about it, and then I did not plan much. All right, so this water is already polluted, but we're going to work with it anyway. So in this particular mix, these are very vibrant colors, except honestly the yellow ochre. So I'm just going to work straight in this yellow ochre because, yeah, I'm going to need all of it. And in fact, I'm going to add more. Then I want to take some red to get it towards an orange. And you could see that the relationship between the amount of yellow ochre and the amount of the pyrrole red was heavily in favor of the yellow ochre. So that's where we are now. Already, this is heavily diluted. I tend to think of things in terms of my first washes, and then I build up. So if you've seen me paint skin before, you know it's a very slow process of building up layers. So for me, this is a good starting value. For you, you might want to start with something a lot more punchy than I'm doing, in which case you would just need to reduce the amount of water and increase the amount of pigment. Now, this is already much less saturated than the red in general, but it's still a little too high on that color wheel. So we want to add just a little blue to neutralize it, because skin colors tend to be pretty neutral. So we really just want a dot of this. And already it's brought it down just enough to make it kind of close to my own skin color. I am very pale. So that's basically how I approach mixing. And then from here, I just push and pull. By its nature, the water will start to evaporate as I work, which will make the colors darker. And then I can just add more pigments to them to make even richer tones. And by playing in this small value range, it keeps me in that sliver of the color wheel where you kind of basically automatically have color harmony. So it makes things fairly easier to have everything look good together. Now, as I work, I actually like to use a lot of purples. So if I were to mix, I'm going to need more blue because I'm used to working with a alizarin crimson or even Indanthrone blue, which is much more punchy, but I absolutely just grabbed the wrong blue because I'm working under my desk, and I picked phthalo blue, red shade, which is also a very warm blue, but it's very staining and it's a very saturated color, which is why that went completely back to blue. Know where things are on your palette. Pay attention to what you're grabbing. So that's the ultramarine again. Yeah, so that's where I like to start bringing in those cooler reds, is to mix these purples. And what I like to do is as I mix, so here's our kind of neutral skin tone, our base skin tone, and wow, that is more red than I realized. As you move into areas of the skin where you have more veins, thinner skin shows more veins, so around your nose, your eyelids, you tend to add you can see more of that red undercolor, so from the blood running through your skin. I can't talk and paint at the same time. So as we move into those regions, we're going to have more red. And that's way too much red, but I'm getting impatient. And then as we move into shadowed areas of the skin, generally we're going to move that to the opposite direction of the color wheel to bring in the shadow, as it's going to neutralize out. So we talked earlier about if you add too much blue, you're going to be pulled towards blue. But if you get towards that middle, that's where you're really starting to fully neutralize the colors. And if you think about shadows, generally they look pretty neutral. So if we start to add in some purple, here when it's just on a white page, it still looks pretty purple, but when you're actually working, it makes a very effective shadow color, because the yellows from the original yellow ochre, and the purple tend to neutralize out. So we get really good shadow colors from that. When we start to hit the orange and we add more blue, orange and blue are opposite on the color wheel, so those neutralize out pretty well. And that's kind of the push and pull I work with. We're moving towards shadows, is just moving across that color wheel. It's why I tend to use purples a lot and blues in the painting. It's just to neutralize, bring across the color wheel, and hit those shadow tones. Now, I like to exaggerate this. I like to have some of that purple showing through, but that's completely up to you. It's how you want to paint. Some people like to really exaggerate. I've seen really stylized paintings where the shadows really are just a wild purple, and it's really cool and it's effective in a very stylized manner because it's using those principles of color theory and just going wild with them. Now, one other thing, I have all these like toys here to play with, and I don't know, I've already gone on for a really long time, but in general, it really helps to understand the structure of the face to know how to paint the skin of the face, because skin is just going to wrap around muscle, which is wrapped around bone, and obviously cartilage too with the nose. I like to keep one of these little skulls handy because it acts as a quick reference at times when I just need to think about the underlying structure. Another tool that I don't have one, but there are digital ones online. I'll try to find one and link to it. And there's digital skulls online too. You don't have to have a physical skull. I just keep him on my desk because he is handy. I think it's called an Etchr head, and it's a more angled version, like a very stylized angled mock-up of the face, but it's really good at showing the planes. So here we have these smooth transitions from the top of the head down, and yeah, we could play with it in different lighting and see where the light's hitting it depending on the angle of the light in relation to the object. But the Etchr head, and I'm gonna feel really dumb if I'm saying that wrong or have the completely wrong name. I will definitely correct myself. But what it does is really simplifies that, so you see a plane, and if this is too much to really see all the details, that is a much simpler version that can definitely help you get going. So, yeah, one other thing real quick before I move on. This is the thing I talked about earlier, where you're not going to get a vibrant green with this palette. And there's nothing wrong with adding greens or adding more colors on the color wheel, those vibrant blues and those brighter yellows. In general, to mix a green, if you don't have a green, you're going to want a cool yellow and a cool blue, and you'll get beautiful greens. So that is one drawback of a palette like this. If you're trying to do a whole painting in it, is you're not going to get those beautiful, beautiful greens. However, if we put it side by side with red, now that's a terrible example, but it's going to look more green based on color relationships. So I think this particular palette is going to be terrible at emphasizing this. And I'm just about to make mud by mistake here. But what I do like about using this version of a green, and more in terms of, and that's something I need to talk about too, I'm just kind of delaying until these dry a little bit. You can make things greenish. Like in my case, I have kind of greenish veins that run through the skin, and making mixes like this is really effective if I just want to add a slight hint of green and make it still feel like skin. Is just using these mixtures to kind of get my yucky green veins. Now, I don't know if this video is already going on way too long, and I haven't gotten to darker skin mixes. We'll let these dry up a bit in the pan, and then I should be able to do some really simple ones without putting too much effort into it, because we've already reduce water through sheer evaporation. But there are a couple techniques I want to talk about in terms of watercolor. And yeah, now I'm trying to think again. All right, so yeah, these are certain. Oh, nope, that is not dry at all. Okay. So 2 techniques I use a lot in watercolor, and I could just talk about this more as I paint the portrait next week. One you've already seen me use. Well, I guess not really. So let's just go with basic. That's wet on dry. The paper's dry, the watercolor is wet. That's wet on wet. The paper's wet, the paint's wet. Things are gonna, well, these are not colors that spread out much on their own, but that pigment is just sitting there. Generally, you can make really interesting blooms and shapes in the water just by adding, let's go with the red, it'll spread out more. It won't, because it's gonna call me a light. It's spreading. I'm just being impatient. There's a million watercolor videos out there that are going to teach these topics, so I'm not going to go into them that much. In general, though, I tend to work when I'm painting in a wet on dry, and that's because I like to have that full control over where I put the paint down. And this, you don't have that control. The paint's going to spread. It's going to do its thing. You can control to some extent by putting your paper at an angle, just to use gravity in your favor. But in general, I tend to prefer this technique. Now, what I do like to do is while that's still wet, I can drag out the edges. So I put down the paint where I really do want it. And then I can just drag out with a little water and smooth those edges. So instead of having those harsh edges, and once again, if this is style, if you're going for something cell shaded, you're gonna want those harsh edges right off the bat. But I like having these gradients basically everywhere, and that's basically how I accomplish it. So just once again, we put it down on the dry paper, clean off the brush. I like to dab off the extra water because some of these brushes hold a ton of water. And then just drag it out. And because this pile is still wet, it's going to disperse a bit too. So it's not going to maintain some of these harsher edges because just like here, it is going to start to disperse. So I get a lot of questions about gradients. That's one of my ways of doing it. The other is just wet on wet. And I did that kind of in the videos where I made the swatch cards, where I wet the whole swatch card and just let kind of gravity do the work of dragging the pigment down. Another thing that really, it really helps to know your pigments. And do I have a brush I can do this with here? This will work. Where did I use the phthalo? I don't think it might be there. Or I didn't actually put it down. I like to lift a lot. So in general, certain colors are not going to lift nicely. And actually, I think this is where some of the phthalo is. This brush is a soft brush. I try not to scrub with these because it will damage the bristles. This is not one of my normal paint brushes. I just had it sitting about. But it's a protege. It's definitely sturdier. And if you wet the page again and then go over it, you can lift the color. Now that I am pretty sure I did have. Blues tend to stain more to begin with, and I think I did have some phthalo in that mixture still. Phthalo is a very staining pigment. Every pigment is going to have its own degree of stainingness. But if we go in and we scrub at these colors, a lot of colors, watercolor, you can lift off. Not completely, but to some extent. This one's actually lifting quite a bit. The ability to lift depends on a few things. It's the paint, the pigment. Like I said already, phthalo blues don't like to lift. They're gonna stain no matter what you're using them on. On the other hand, a lot of paints will lift more on cellulose paper because on a cellulose paper, the paint tends to sit on top of the surface more, whereas on a cotton paper like this one, the paint's going to get sucked in more and be captured within the paper itself. So this is cotton, and by default, cotton doesn't lift as much. But you can see we've had some lifts in these three. I didn't even... Actually, quinacridone rose is a little bit more stubborn than I even realized. There we go. So already you can see that, yeah, we've managed to lift a little paint in all four of those. And the red one is the one that lifted the most. That could also partially be because it wasn't fully dry yet. Lifting actually works a lot easier before the paint all soaks into the paper. So just something to keep in mind, that just because you put paint somewhere that you didn't necessarily want it doesn't mean you can't go back necessarily and lift the highlight in. So I'll use this like to add highlights around the eye or on the nose, on the lips. Just pull up a little pigment after the fact and get a little bit of a highlight. And then you could even fill that back in. So if you wanted to have a slightly lighter tone for that highlight, you can add that after the fact. You know what? I think I do have a little color wheel, but it's not a good one. Let me pull that out. I do. Okay, so this is something I talked about briefly here, that one thing I like to do, and I think is very effective, is I use this more in terms of shadows, but I like to shift the value and the color at the same time. And you could do this in a stylized manner too. Like, these are pretty close in value, but you still see there's color differences, and you can play with that and make some shadows that aren't that shadowed, that still give the appearance of a shadow. That's a really bad way to explain it. Just by shifting the chroma. So in skin, we start with something like this. This is all about adding different values. So this is more about, we'll use this side instead then. So let's say our skin started off somewhere in here. To push shadows, if I'm doing an orange and I want to add a shadow, I like to move both towards the next... I don't like this thing. Here we go. If I'm going to move from here down, I also want to shift this way. If I'm going to move here, and now I can't go up. If I'm going to move from here and then add highlights, I like to also not just shift up, but shift over. So it builds a much more interesting picture overall to have these kind of shifts, I think. So as and it doesn't have to be dramatic. Like here we have our base skin tone. It's slightly red, slightly purple, and it makes things to me a lot more interesting. So if I see my, I guess it didn't evaporate that much, or I just added a bunch more water back into the brush without paying attention. So going straight from red to blue, or orange to blue. Can you tell I haven't had my coffee yet today? That's very stark. But by making these slow, gradual transitions, I think it makes for a much more interesting glow to the skin. So that's kind of how I like to work in that manner. I also caution against using straight up blue. in your mixes, especially early on. And I mean early on in the painting. One thing to keep in mind as we go to the more shadowed areas, and I'm not sure this is showing well, but think about a face, a general face, and then we have the jawline. The jawline's going to tend to be more shadowed, but if we go all the way to blue on someone's face, it's going to start to look like a 5 o'clock shadow. And that might be effective if you're going for like a guy that has a 5 o'clock shadow. But if you go all the way to blue on a woman, you probably don't want to give her a 5 o'clock shadow. Now, there's a lot that plays into this depending on the lighting scenario you're using. Maybe it's nighttime and having blue is perfectly fitting for the scene. I don't think I mentioned it, but I was just going for like a general mid-light portrait. I don't know. So I tend to go more towards a purple for females, and if I'm pushing that 5 o'clock shadow, I'll go towards more of a blue for men, but it's always gradual, and this will be easier to show when I go through a painting versus just doing swatches on a page. Yeah, I'm not sure this is effective at all. So, one more thing I definitely want to address in this video, and that is just general color zones of the face. I have a pencil here somewhere. So pretend this horrible thing is a face. In general, for a standard portrait in standard mid lighting, throw that on the ground. It's really easy to come in and fill this in with one color and then add color as you go. And there's nothing wrong with that. I work with like that a lot. We start adding some like reds where around the eyes where that, okay, I guess I do work a little wet and wet for these initial washes. I don't have any red left. I'm an idiot. I just can't see what I'm doing. All right. So we know that the nose area and the cheeks tend to be a bit more rosy. The eyes actually have a bit more redness to them too because the skin on the eyelids is very thin. We get a little bit more redness around the lips because they are by default. Now, as I mentioned over here, we can go towards that purple or a blue for the shadowed areas. And this is way too wet to work on like this, so it's just going to spread out like crazy. But just using these little bits of color difference, you can already start to see maybe, hey June, how we can build up color and value at the same time. But in general, how do I put this? Skins kind of have color zones. And we can definitely take advantage of that too. So we already talked about like your base color and then doing some red on top of it. But we can push that further. Skin tends to, and I'm moving away from the mic, so I apologize. Skin tends to have a bit of a color variation between the top of the head, and I'm just going to exaggerate this for the purpose of this little diagram here. But the center of the face, as we discussed, between the eyes, the nose, the cheeks, tends to aim a little bit more red. The top of the head actually tends to be a little bit more yellow. And then the bottom part of the face tends to be a bit more blue. And we're not ever going to actually paint in this way, but it's something I like to think about, because if we just start throwing in colors like that, we start to lose the fact that the forehead does tend to have a bit more yellow to it, but depending on whether it's reflected light or just the fact that the skin's a little thicker and doesn't show the veins quite as much, and it maintains more of that boring yellow undertone. And once again, this is totally like a white person like me. In fact, I'm so pale, I don't have this much variation at all. But you can definitely use a more subtle version of this gradient instead of coming in with this straight color. That's the color I'm talking about. if you really want to push things. So get more of that initial yellow. We can start making a gradient. And obviously we don't need it to be this dramatic. Get a little bit more red back in there where the lips are, and then back towards our purple. And in terms of a face, these little things that you can do with the underpainting can actually result in just a more interesting portrait. Now, I'm not great about doing this. It's something I like to play with and then I'll forget for a long period of time. But just the side by side of this flat and this, you already have something a little bit more interesting to build on. So this is not required. None of this is required. But it's just something to keep in mind that the skin, the face in general, has these color zones. And by playing with them, you can really push things. Now, that thing has turned out to be quite horrific. And I do apologize for that. But I don't know how much more I can say at this point without creating a whole painting, because once again, I'm not great at explaining this stuff, and I don't feel I'm in a position to really, no, I'm making it way worse. This little tiny sketch is haunting in a terrible way. I have many regrets now. Not fixing it. It's so much worse. I don't like it. Okay. I'm over it. So I know that in this video I talked a lot and I demonstrated very little, so I'm going to rewatch this later and hopefully be able to pull together something that's useful, because I'm worried that this entire video is useless at this point. But in the next video, I will do a portrait and I will try to show some more of these mixes as I go and how I build up as I actually create the portrait, using some of these techniques, showing where I'm doing these. Wow, I just realized that pulling there still dried with a pretty harsh edge, but in a lot of cases we can still go back, reactivate the paint around the outside a little bit and soften it up more, so that's not a problem. I'm already completely distracted again. So yeah, basically, in conclusion, we talked a bit about color theory, how to use the color wheel, using single pigments, the color palettes I like to use for skin, which we'll get into a little bit more in the next video. Once again, you do you. You do not have to follow these skin tones at all. In fact, I know one painter I followed on Patreon loved to use quinacridone coral and green gold, and that actually kind of shortcuts your blue for you because it's in the green gold. So come up with palettes that work for you. This is just what really works for me, at least at this point in time. We talked about value shifting with color shifting, some basic mixes and how we get these neutral skin colors, and this horrific clown that's going to haunt me now. I don't have too much to say on the topics of what brands you should get. In this case, I use Daniel Smith because here in the United States, these paints are readily available. You could get the 5ml tubes, so you could get a set that's not horribly expensive. And I have the colors I work with in this particular brand. I also have Schmincke, Beam Paints, and a few others that I kind of can work with in the same egg yellow you saw last time. So you can pretty much do these same techniques with any paint brand you have, but I do like Daniel Smith. I'm not saying you need to get it though. Work with what you've got. Definitely don't need to go out, run to the store, buy more paints, buy different brands. this is pretty much what I do no matter what paint brand I pick up, to the extent that even I got these same colors in gouache plus white, because you need white in gouache to make the same kind of skin tones. Otherwise, I don't really have too much to say about brushes or paper. If you have questions, I'll try to answer them in the comments below. And yeah, I do apologize because this video was very rambly and probably not terribly coherent, but I hope that maybe this was helpful to some extent. And I will show this in action more in the next video. Take care of yourselves for now. Bye.